A desperate lioness drops to her belly before a massive silverback gorilla, her eyes pleading as heart-wrenching roars escape her throat. She's begging, actually begging for help to save her trapped cub from certain death. What the gorilla does next defies every law of nature and left wildlife experts questioning everything they thought they knew about animal intelligence and compassion. This unprecedented act of cross-species communication and the shocking response that followed would rewrite scientific understanding forever.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
But to understand how this extraordinary moment came to be, we have to go back just 2 days earlier to a scene of liberation and hope. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Zambezi Wildlife Sanctuary in Zimbabwe, where one of Africa's most ambitious conservation projects was reaching a triumphant milestone. After 3 years of legal battles, international pressure, and tireless advocacy, the facility was finally releasing its last group of captive lions back into protected wilderness. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the sanctuary's head veterinarian, stood beside a reinforced transport vehicle, her clipboard trembling slightly in the cool dawn air. Today marked the end of a heartbreaking chapter and the beginning of something beautiful. Inside the specially designed enclosure sat Amara, a magnificent lioness whose golden coat bore the subtle scars of her tragic past. Amara had been rescued from an illegal breeding facility where she had spent 4 years in deplorable conditions. Her powerful frame, though now healthy thanks to months of rehabilitation, still carried the psychological wounds of captivity. Her amber eyes, once dulled by despair, had slowly regained their wild fire during her recovery. Most importantly, she had given birth to a healthy cub during her rehabilitation, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. The release site had been meticulously chosen within the Mana Pools National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its pristine ecosystem and successful conservation programs. The area boasted healthy populations of various wildlife species, including a small but stable community of mountain gorillas that had recently migrated from higher elevations due to climate changes. Crystal-clear springs provided fresh water, while vast acacia woodlands offered perfect hunting grounds for a lioness ready to reclaim her ancestral role as an apex predator. Hidden motion cameras had confirmed the presence of suitable prey animals and, most encouragingly, signs of other lions in the territory. Everything suggested that Amara and her 6-month-old cub, Django, could thrive here and potentially integrate with existing pride structures.
With careful precision, Dr. Rodriguez activated the remote release mechanism that would open Amara's transport cage. The heavy steel doors swung open with a soft metallic click that seemed to echo across the silent landscape. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, cautiously, a magnificent lioness emerged into the wild world that was now her home. Amara was a vision of feline grace and power. Her muscular frame spoke of royal bloodlines, while her intelligent amber eyes surveyed her new domain with the calculating gaze of a natural-born hunter. Years of captivity had not dulled her instincts. They had only compressed them, like a spring waiting to be released. Her golden coat gleamed in the morning sunlight, and despite her traumatic past, she moved with the fluid confidence that marked her as true royalty of the African wilderness. Behind her, tumbling playfully from the transport cage, came her most precious treasure, little Django. The 6-month-old cube was pure energy and curiosity, his oversized paws and gangly proportions promising future strength and size. His coat was a lighter shade than his mother's, marked with the faint rosettes that would fade as he matured. Most endearing were his bright, fearless eyes that saw the vast wilderness not as danger, but as the ultimate playground. Django immediately began exploring his new world with the boundless enthusiasm of youth, chasing butterflies and pouncing on rustling leaves while his mother maintained a protective watch. The bond between them was unmistakable. Every few minutes, the cube would bound back to Amara's side for reassurance before venturing off again on another micro-adventure. Meanwhile, less than half a mile away in the dense riverine forest, another character in this unfolding drama remained completely unaware of the new arrivals. Kondo, a massive silverback gorilla, had established himself as the unlikely guardian of this unique ecosystem. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and weighing over 400 pounds, Kondo was a gentle giant whose intelligence had been documented by researchers for years.
But paradise often conceals its own perils, and this pristine wilderness harbored dangers that even the most careful conservation planning couldn't predict. Deep within the rocky ravines that cut through the landscape like ancient scars, something had been stirring since before dawn. Heavy rains from the previous week had weakened the limestone foundations of several cliff faces, creating unstable conditions that would prove catastrophic. The geological instability was invisible to the naked eye, but seismic sensors buried throughout the park had been recording subtle vibrations for days. What appeared to be solid ground was actually a network of underground caves and water channels that had been gradually undermining the structural integrity of the entire area. The weight of accumulated rainwater, combined with natural erosion, had created a disaster waiting to happen. The specific area where Amara and Django were exploring sat directly above one of the largest underground caverns in the region. Ancient river systems had carved out massive hollow spaces beneath the seemingly solid surface, creating a natural trap that could collapse without warning. Geological surveys had identified this risk years earlier, but recent climate changes had accelerated the erosion process far beyond all predictions. Adding to the danger was an abandoned research station from the 1980s, built during a previous conservation project and later forgotten. The concrete structure, with its network of underground storage chambers and observation tunnels, had been slowly deteriorating for decades. Rusted metal supports and crumbling concrete had turned what was once a scientific facility into a maze of unstable passages and hidden pitfalls. Most ominously, the morning's gentle breeze carried subtle signs of the impending catastrophe. Tiny pebbles occasionally rolling down cliff faces, the distant groaning of stressed rock formations, and an almost imperceptible trembling in the ground that only the most sensitive animals might detect. The beautiful landscape that had seemed so perfect for Amara's new beginning was actually a ticking bomb, and mother and cub were unknowingly walking directly into the danger zone where solid earth could become a deadly trap in mere seconds. Completely unaware of the geological time bomb beneath their paws, Amara and little Django continued their joyful exploration of freedom. The lioness had chosen to follow a game trail that wound along the edge of the ravine, drawn by the scent of fresh water and the promise of prey animals that would visit the stream below. It seemed like the perfect route to establish their new territory. Django, drunk on the intoxicating freedom of the wild, bounded ahead of his mother with reckless enthusiasm. Everything was a new adventure, the strange sounds of unfamiliar birds, the exotic scents carried on the breeze, the fascinating textures of bark and stone beneath his paws. His playful nature led him to investigate every shadow, every rustling bush, every interesting rock formation. Dr. Rodriguez and her team, monitoring the release from their distant observation post, watched through high-powered binoculars with growing satisfaction. Both mother and cub appeared to be adapting beautifully to their new environment. Amara's body language showed increasing confidence, while Django's boundless energy suggested he was thriving in his natural habitat. But their elevated position couldn't reveal the invisible danger lurking beneath the surface. With each step closer to the ravine's edge, the unstable ground beneath them grew more precarious. Hairline fractures in the limestone were spreading like spiderwebs, weakened by decades of water erosion and recent heavy rains.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The abandoned research station's underground chambers had filled with groundwater, adding tremendous pressure to already compromised foundations. Every footfall, every playful pounce from the young cub sent tiny vibrations through the deteriorating support structure. The weight of the two lions, though relatively small, was the final stressor that an already failing system couldn't bear. As Django chased a bright butterfly toward a particularly scenic overlook, his innocent play was about to trigger a catastrophe that would test the bonds between species in ways that science had never documented. The ground beneath the beautiful vista was mere moments away from complete collapse, and with it, any hope of a peaceful new beginning in the wild.
The catastrophe struck with terrifying suddenness. As little Django pounced playfully toward the cliff's edge, chasing his butterfly prize, the weakened limestone finally reached its breaking point. A thunderous crack split the morning air as a massive section of ground simply vanished beneath the young cub's paws. In one horrifying instant, what had been solid earth became a gaping chasm of crumbling rock and twisted metal. Django's terrified cry echoed from the depths as he plummeted through collapsing debris into the underground labyrinth of the abandoned research station. The sound was heart-wrenching, a baby's call for help that cut through every maternal instinct Amara possessed. She rushed to the edge of the newly formed crater, her powerful claws digging into the unstable rim as she peered desperately into the dark void where her cub had disappeared. The scene below was a nightmare of twisted metal beams, concrete slabs, and rushing water from burst underground pipes. Django was trapped, approximately 30 feet down, caught in a maze of debris that had formed a precarious cage around him. He was alive. His frightened mules confirmed that, but he was pinned beneath a fallen beam, unable to move or climb to safety. Amara's anguished roars filled the air as she paced frantically around the crater's edge. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to leap down and rescue her cub, but her intelligence told her that the crumbling walls would never support her weight. Any attempt to descend would likely cause further collapse, potentially killing them both. For nearly an hour, she tried everything her desperate mind could conceive. She clawed at the loose rock, attempting to create a pathway down. She called continuously to Django, her voice providing the only comfort she could offer. She even attempted to drag fallen branches to the edge, hoping to create some kind of makeshift ramp. But as the sun climbed higher and Django's cries grew weaker, Amara realized with growing desperation that she couldn't save her cub alone. She needed help, and in this vast wilderness, help seemed impossible to find.
As the hours passed, the situation became increasingly desperate. The morning sun had given way to the scorching heat of midday, and Django's weakened cries from the depths suggested he was rapidly losing strength. The underground chambers were slowly filling with water from the burst pipes, turning the debris field into a deadly flood zone that threatened to drown the trapped cub. Amara's maternal instincts drove her to increasingly frantic behavior. She had worn a circular path around the crater's edge, her powerful paws leaving deep gouges in the earth as she paced endlessly. Her roars of distress had grown hoarse, but she continued calling to her cub, as if her voice alone could somehow lift him to safety. The lioness's desperation reached a critical point when she noticed the water level rising around Django's prison. She could hear the terrified splashing as her cub struggled to keep his head above the mounting flood. Time was running out with devastating speed, and her maternal rage at her own helplessness was driving her to the edge of complete breakdown.
In her mounting panic, Amara began making increasingly dangerous attempts to reach her cub. She scraped away at the crater's walls until her claws were bloody, sending cascades of loose rock tumbling down toward Django. She backed up and charged toward the edge repeatedly, only stopping at the last second when her intelligence overcame her desperation. Each failed attempt only made her more frantic and erratic. Her anguished roars had grown so continuous and intense that they began to echo across the entire landscape, a sound of pure maternal agony that carried for miles through the wilderness. It was a call that spoke of love, loss, and desperate need, a sound so primal and heartbreaking that it seemed to touch something fundamental in the very fabric of the natural world. What Amara didn't realize was that her cries of desperation had reached ears that understood suffering, intelligence that could comprehend crisis, and a heart that had its own deep capacity for compassion. Help was coming from a direction she could never have imagined.
As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Amara's world collapsed into the darkest moment of her life. Django's cries from the flooded chamber below had grown progressively weaker, reduced to barely audible whimpers that spoke of exhaustion and hypothermia. The rising water had reached a critical level, and the sound of her cub's desperate splashing was becoming less frequent and more labored. The lioness herself was reaching the limits of physical and emotional endurance. Hours of frantic pacing, clawing, and roaring had left her dehydrated and trembling with exhaustion. Her magnificent golden coat was matted with dust and blood from her desperate attempts to dig through the rocky debris. Her voice had become a raspy whisper, no longer capable of the powerful roars that had echoed across the landscape all day. But it was the psychological torment that threatened to break her completely. Every maternal instinct in her powerful body screamed at her to save her cub, yet she remained helplessly trapped above ground while her baby slowly drowned below. The sound of rushing water from the broken pipes had become a countdown to disaster, each gurgle and splash marking another moment closer to unthinkable loss. Amara's behavior began to show signs of complete mental breakdown. She started making increasingly irrational attempts to reach Django, including several near-suicidal charges toward the crater's edge that only stopped when loose rock crumbled beneath her paws, sending her scrambling backward. Her amber eyes, once bright with intelligence and dignity, now reflected the wild desperation of a mother facing the loss of everything she lived for. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the disaster zone, Amara collapsed near the crater's edge in complete exhaustion. Her sides heaved with labored breathing as she stared helplessly into the depths, where her cub's survival was measured in minutes, not hours. For the first time since the collapse, her roars stopped entirely, replaced by a profound silence that spoke of surrender and approaching grief. In that moment of absolute despair, when all hope seemed lost, something extraordinary was about to happen.
Just when all hope seemed extinguished, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush announced an arrival that would change everything. Kondo, the massive silverback gorilla, emerged from the forest with the deliberate power of a force of nature. He had been following the sound of Amara's distressed calls for over an hour, his intelligent mind recognizing something in those cries that transcended species boundaries, the universal language of a parent in desperate need. The sight that greeted him was unlike anything in his years of wilderness experience. A magnificent lioness, natural apex predator and potential threat, lay collapsed beside a gaping crater, her body language speaking of complete exhaustion and despair. But what struck Kondo most profoundly were her eyes, amber pools of such raw anguish that they communicated across every barrier evolution had placed between their species.
What happened next defied every textbook on animal behavior. Amara, recognizing the presence of another intelligent being, slowly rose to her feet and did something that left even seasoned researchers speechless. She approached the massive gorilla and, in a gesture that seemed to transcend the natural order itself, lowered her entire body to the ground in a posture of submission and supplication. Her eyes never left Kondo's face as she began to emit soft, rhythmic vocalizations, not the roars of a predator, but the gentle, pleading sounds of a mother begging for help. She crawled closer to the crater's edge and looked down at her trapped cub, then back at the gorilla, repeating this sequence over and over. The message was unmistakable. She was actually asking this massive stranger to help save her baby. Kondo stood motionless for several long moments, his dark eyes moving between the desperate lioness and the crater. His massive chest rose and fell with deep, thoughtful breaths as he processed this unprecedented situation. Then, in a display of intelligence that would rewrite scientific understanding of great ape cognition, he approached the crater's edge and began his own careful assessment of the rescue challenge below. What Kondo accomplished next would be studied by scientists for decades to come. With methodical intelligence, he began gathering the sturdiest fallen branches from the surrounding forest, testing each one for strength and length. His massive hands worked with surprising delicacy as he wove the branches together, creating an improvised rope ladder strong enough to support his 400-pound frame. Without hesitation, the silverback secured his makeshift ladder to the crater's edge and began his descent into the flooded chamber. The sight of this enormous gorilla carefully navigating the treacherous debris field to reach a trapped lion cub defied every law of natural behavior. His dark eyes remained focused on the small golden form struggling in the rising water below. When Kondo reached Django, he gently lifted the exhausted cub with hands capable of crushing bone but gentle enough to cradle a butterfly. The young lion, too weak to resist, simply clung to his unlikely rescuer as the gorilla began the careful ascent back to safety. Each step was deliberate, calculated to avoid further collapse. Above ground, Amara watched in stunned silence as her cub emerged from what had seemed like certain death. When Kondo finally reached the surface and gently placed Django on solid ground, the lioness immediately rushed to her baby, checking every inch of his small body with desperate licks and nuzzles. The young cub was weak but alive, his breathing steady and his eyes bright with the resilience of youth. He would survive this ordeal, and the trauma would fade with time. But what would never fade was the extraordinary bond forged between species in a moment of ultimate crisis. In the golden light of late afternoon, as Django nursed safely beside his mother, something extraordinary continued to unfold. Amara approached Kondo one final time, but instead of the desperate supplication of hours before, her posture now conveyed profound gratitude. She gently touched her forehead to the gorilla's massive hand, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement that transcended every boundary nature had supposedly placed between them. Dr. Rodriguez and her team, who had witnessed the entire rescue through their cameras, sat in stunned silence. They had documented behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence, empathy, and communication. The footage would spark international scientific debate and forever change how we understand the emotional lives of wildlife. What made this rescue truly shocking wasn't just Kondo's heroic actions, but Amara's ability to communicate her desperate need across species lines. Her begging gesture revealed cognitive abilities that science is only beginning to comprehend. The capacity to recognize intelligence in others, to appeal to empathy, and to trust in the goodness of strangers. This remarkable encounter demonstrates that compassion isn't exclusively human. The ability to recognize suffering, to feel empathy for others, and to risk everything for those in need exists throughout the animal kingdom in ways that humble our understanding of consciousness and connection. In a world often divided by differences, we witnessed the power of universal language, the language of love, desperation, and hope that connects all parents regardless of species. Sometimes the most profound communications happen not through words, but through the simple recognition of shared vulnerability and the courage to trust in the kindness of others.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.